This week on the Sports Initiative podcast, I sit down with coach and coach developer Jamie Tayler. He discusses his process as a coach developer and some of his thoughts around this industry, how he takes academic content and puts it into a practical perspective, as well as some of his work at Leicester Tigers and the Wasp Academy. As always, if you enjoy this podcast, please make sure you share it with friends and family. I hope you enjoy. Perfect. So, Jamie, really appreciate you scheduling a second appointment with me after I missed our last one. But how are things your end? All okay?
No, thanks for having me, Michael. I really appreciate it. So, and no problem at all.
Perfect. So, for people that don't know you, haven't come across your work, could you just explain for everyone, I guess, who you are and what you do?
Yeah. So, and look, we were actually just chatting a bit offline, just about the what a privilege it is to do the jobs that we do. But I suppose I split my role in three ways really. One is I'm an assistant professor at Dublin City University, where we run a professional doctorate program, and I supervise people who are working in high performance sports, lots of different areas, and we've also got a couple of interesting research projects we're going with different sporting bodies. Um, I work as a coach developer at Grey Matters, where again I've got the real privilege of working with lots of interesting people across sport and helping coaches develop their practice. And the third string, or I suppose the third area I work is I'm a coach at what is now called Midlands Academy Central and used to be called Wasps Academy.
Perfect. Yeah, we won't go too much into the Wasp Academy stuff. Obviously, the fortunes of the club, which is really unfortunate, and actually one a little bit after my own heart. So when I was at QPR as a schoolboy, Wasps and QPR used to train in the same thing. So I remember Trevor Leota flipping tires and seeing Joe Worsley walking out and be like, "Geez, look at the size of these guys." So yeah, definitely an unfortunate one seeing what happened to them. But I think a really nice breadth of experience and loads of stuff that we can get onto. Um, in terms of, I guess, let's start with the lecturing role, if you like, or the supervisor role. Firstly, what drew you to that? What drew you to kind of being around that space?
So I think I don't know. Let's say if we go back 10 or 15 years, where I am a coach who's really enjoying getting to know practice. And when I say getting to know it, I wasn't really getting to know it. I was just accumulating experience. I was getting stuck into more and more reading and going, right, okay, so I'm hearing lots of different things. I'm getting lots of ideas from lots of places. But there was a real desire for me to start understanding coaching better, and not just at the type of surface level that we might get if we start reading blogs, if we start doing this. I started reading more and more research papers. I started going, oh, right, okay, there's actually some really useful stuff in here. There are some really useful ideas that I can take and I can apply to my practice. And had by chance managed to connect with somebody who's had a really formative effect on my whole life, really, which is one of my current bosses, Professor Dave Collins, and from there enrolled into a PhD program. Finished my PhD 3 years ago at Edinburgh, looking at effectively lots of different ideas from talent development coaching, sports psychology, and ultimately how those things and how we might support somebody to develop a level of expertise. And really, really pleased that I ended up following that road, because I think it's lots of people look at, say, the term academic is often used in a negative way, and I think often people miss out on really understanding what the value it has to offer people.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting space. So we've had some former guests on here, like Megan Hill, who has done work around RAE, and that with Sean Cummins from the University of Bath. We've also had Tom Brown on from a cricket perspective, who was looking at South Asian talent ID in cricket and some challenges there. So I guess the question for me around that is how do people going through that process actually come up with some interesting topics to discuss? Because I imagine there's certain parts of academia that have been really well thought out now, and have probably been discussed to the hundredth degree. But how do they begin to, or how do you begin to come to a point of going, actually, we think that this is a really interesting avenue to go down, and it may have practical implications for coaches, for coach developers, for athletes further down the road?
Well, I suppose I probably come at it from a slightly different angle, in that because I'm in practice and because I see what the challenges of practice are, a lot of I suppose a lot of the avenues I chase are coming more from a practical lens than they are from an academic lens of, right, we've investigated this and now we see further opportunity to, let's say, look at relative age in a different population. Because because I'm in it, I start seeing more practical problems and more practical questions. And look, the way that I would describe that is by being a pracademic, which is somebody who has a foot in both camps, but also is significantly influenced by both, and it becomes less a question of what's the literature currently chasing, and more here are some practical problems. How do we understand this, and how might we go about investigating this? So, and as far as I'm concerned, particularly in the field of coaching, there are so many interesting questions to chase that so far I haven't really come across many issues with formulating those kinds of questions. The bigger problems become with how do you formulate a robust evidence base against them, less so finding the questions, because every coach everywhere knows there's plenty of questions to be asked.
Yeah, I think the research pitch is interesting as well in terms of actually how do you get academia that can support it or challenge it or whatnot, which obviously in that space is necessary. Um, from your perspective, what springs to mind immediately of some questions that might be worth investigated or currently are being investigated that interest you? Yeah, what around that space do you think are some interesting topics?
Oh, that's a great question. So one for me, a couple of different really interesting areas, I think. One is at the moment, historically, if I look back over coach education, coach development, we have tended to focus on discrete areas of practice and also quite discrete ways in which we might develop coaches. So if I am a developing coach, I might look at a series of competencies or a series of knowledges that I might want to develop as a coach. And the presumption being that if I know this, and this, well, I might be a better coach. And I think there's a different way to look at it. And the expert has looked at it slightly differently and going, what are the types of cognitive challenges that the most expert coaches have to navigate? And what is it that enables them to be able to navigate those challenges? And that's almost it's a subtly different way of looking at it, but it has a really big practical and meaningful impact. Because if you understand what are expert coaches doing in their day-to-day practice, and therefore how do you help somebody develop these types of let's say we'll call it ability to make sense of problems, and the ability of a coach to flexibly execute against their plans. It flips coach education, coach development on its head completely, and enables coaches to work with a more towards something that's a little bit more valid in their practice than I need to acquire all this knowledge and then I just need to do something with that knowledge.
Okay, so I'm going to try and decipher what I think that means, and please correct me if I'm wrong. But I think historically in the coach development space or courses that I've been on, you might look at particular strategies or tactics to use in a game and go, well, actually, if they're playing a 4-4-2, you could go to a 4-3-3 or something like that. Whereas what I'm hearing you say potentially is that actually, if you can work on the individual's ability to analyze what's happening in the game, focusing on the analytical skills is more paramount for them than actually having a knowledge base of loads of tactics and stuff, because it's about understanding and analyzing what's happening in the game, and you're working on the analytical piece rather than just going, well, you know all the formations now, so you should be able to use it?
Well, I suppose in part, but let's put it like this. So let's say I'm watching you coach and you flip from a 4-3-3 to a 4-4-2. I might have the best analytic skills in the world, but I've absolutely no basis from which to understand why you've done that, because I don't know your game enough. So it's a bit of both. It's I need to know enough to be able to go, yeah, okay, I understand why you might do this, why you might not do that. But the bigger thing is, let's say, what I want to be able to do is understand in this context here now, what are the factors that help me understand why I might move 4-3-3 to 4-4-2? And let's say in an academy context, why am I doing that? Is it because I'm trying to win the game with what I've got now? Is it because the players in front of me there's a longer term agenda because I want this player here to be exposed to this much space and I want him or her to be able to develop in a particular way? Is it because there's a longer term agenda through the academy of exposing players to playing in different ways? Is it because we want to induce a bit of a developmental challenge for particular players? There's that type of reasoning and those types of problems, and what a coach puts into thinking about a formation change. That's probably more where I'd be coming from, and it requires both definitely, by the way, just to be clear, coaches need to know a lot. It's just how they use that knowledge is what I think is important.
No, that makes complete sense. And it actually leads nicely on to my next question. So the contextualized bit is something that really interests me and something we get a lot in football. And it'd be interesting for you to hear this from your experience, particularly in rugby. Is someone will go and look at a Pep Guardiola or a Jurgen Klopp and go, oh, I'm going to use those tactics, or I've read an article and they do this, not understanding that the context is key of what the current performance of players is, what's the long-term pathway, as you mentioned, what are the challenges that we're having, and also where are they on their journey? Are they a first team player that's trying to win Premier League, Champions League, or are they a 13-year-old child who's trying to develop skill and understand self and a level of self-awareness, all that type of stuff? So how do you get coaches to be aware of actually what good looks like in their context or in their environment or their stage along the journey and where they're working with individuals?
Well, I often think, and I hear this a lot, that one of the risks we end up with is trying to help somebody understand what good looks like. So we'll take the Pep example. Very, very clearly, one of the very best coaches in any sport in the world. But if I just watch what he does and not understand why he does it, and that's what in academic parlance you'd call that procedural knowledge. I know what he does. Declarative knowledge being I know why he's adopting that. The risk is that coaches only adopt procedural knowledge, which is I can see what good is, so therefore I do what good is, instead of going, right, well, why is somebody doing this? What's most appropriate for the people in front of me in the context they're in? And that's the difference between a copy and paste approach and a let's reason from first principles, reason from declarative knowledge, and be able to design something that's really appropriate for the context that you're in.
And from a coach developer point of view, how would you assist someone in gaining that understanding of actually this is the journey that you need to be on, and maybe actually the copy and paste model isn't going to benefit you, but going down this exploration piece potentially will? How do you go around framing that for them in that space?
Well, an approach that we recently had a play with and actually published the idea is that one of the ways I now observe coaches, and it depends on the level of coach, is that I've adopted an approach called the 3 Ps, which is effectively what you're trying to do is put yourself inside the head of the coach when you're watching them, and you're going, right, why might they be doing that? First P is procedure. So what are the ways in which they're managing the session? Typical example I'd be is, let's say, if you do a demonstration with your back to the sun with a group of foundation phase players, you know what's going to happen. Or if you do a demonstration with your back to another group that are doing something very interesting, good luck focusing that group's attention on what you're trying to coach them. Nice, neat example. You've then got and I suppose that's where a lot of coach education, early coach education, perhaps rightly focuses. It becomes very competency based. I can see this. Can the coach do this? Tick. Has the coach checked the pitch for dog mess, for needles, depending where you are, whatever? Tick. Yes. Okay. We then enter a world where we enter this world of maybes, if, buts, whys. Why might you do this? Why might you not? You do this, and you can split the ways in which people make decisions into quicker decisions, more intuitive ones, and slower, more thoughtful ones. So when I'm observing a coach, I'd be looking at it going, right, well, when has this decision been made here? Why might they be making that decision? Is it a quick, snappy one? Or is it one that we've discussed before the session? They're trying to pull a thread through the next 6 weeks of their coaching. And off the back of that, that's for me when the why start. Why? So tell me what you've done. Why might you have done this? What other ways could you have done it? And why might you have chosen one of those different ways? And probably most importantly in all of this is getting at a coach's intentions. What are they actually trying to achieve? Rather than, I've seen this, Pep does this. Well, actually, what are you trying to achieve? And why are you trying to achieve it?
And how, I guess, when we're looking at then at practice design, how do you help them, I guess, challenge in that space? Because ultimately that is, you mentioned there around, is this a thread over 6 weeks, or is this something they've just picked up then? Practice design has quite a big part to play in that, in terms of if I've got a long thread over 6 weeks, I need to make sure that exposure is coming out of my practice. And people normally replicate what they've had exposure to, be it as a player or who they work with as a coach, and that's normally what informs their thinking. So how do you go around helping them challenge their practice design, going, actually, there might be a different way that allows you to better expose that thread, or expose it in a different environment that might allow them to contextualize it in 2 or 3 ways, rather than them knowing exactly what the practice is, so therefore are trying to win the practice rather than making them solve problems, etc. So yeah, how do you go around challenging them around practice design and utilization in that space?
Well, I would flip it completely, and I wouldn't start with practice design. I'd always be starting with, what are you trying to achieve, and how do you want the player to interact with the session? What do you want the player to be experiencing when they're in your session? And I would work backwards from that rather than forwards from, right, here is practice design. This is the way that I do it. One of the big things I see in football, particularly, and less so in other places, is that coaches often go, right, I've got a session here. It works really well. And I'm often left going, right, well, who does it work well for, and why does it work well? Is it because it flows, which is often how often coaches use the idea of flow through a session as being a real positive. Often that is low level of mistakes, players understanding things straight away, rather than going, let's say, if I'm a player in your session, do I want my players to actively be exploring something reasonably new? Do I want them feeling safe to make lots of mistakes? Or do I want them to be refining something they can already do? Or do I want them to feel a level of pressure and almost a lack of safety, because that's what the game confers on them ultimately? Okay, depending on that, how do I change my session design, my learning design? Because obviously, like, you're doing loads of stuff that's not just on the pitch. It's, how am I using huddle before a session? How am I? Who am I chatting to before a session? How am I setting things up? What kind of goal setting process am I engaging players in? And then there's how do I approach my session when I'm in it? Both the tools I use, and almost like the emotional tone of how I am. All of those things need to be wrapped up together, rather than just, hey, well, if I have 4 goals here instead of 2 goals, yeah, but I don't believe in more than 1 goal, or well, let's not do rondos because that's not what the game is. I think it should be way more sophisticated than that.
Yeah, I love the fact that you're challenging conventional wisdoms, by the way, because this is like the whole reason I started this podcast is for people like this to go, actually, have you thought about it in this way, which is really, really interesting. Um, so I guess for you then, how are you encouraging coaches to give that a go? Because traditional means would say, plan my session, figure out interactions around it. Whereas what you're suggesting here is quite a flip of going, actually, can I consider interactions? Can I consider how I'm going to act tonally? And again, that may change during session from what you've seen, but going and I would like it to feel and sense and players to feel like this, and then I'm going to plan what that may introduce for me in terms of practice design. How do you get coaches to buy into that and have a go at that? Because I can imagine there'll be some stubborn individuals out there that are thinking, I don't want to give that a go. That sounds very risky.
Well, look, in lots of ways, I found some of it reasonably easy because for me as a coach, I want to understand whether I'm doing a good job at what I'm doing. And if I finish a session without having intentions, without being really clear about what I'm trying to achieve, well, what am I reflecting against? What am I thinking about other than, oh, it seems to be all right. Oh, that bit flowed. And then, oh, I tell you what, we'll stop reflecting on me now and let's start talking about which players were good. And as soon as you start establishing, right, what are we trying to do here? And did we get our intent? Did we see our intended effect? Then I think you can. I think it's almost reasonably quick buy-in for lots of coaches. Know whether they're doing a decent job, but most coaches spend a lot of their time without having the ability to reason about that and think about that because they're not setting intentions in the first place.
I guess to a degree as well, it makes it an easier reflection slash assessment tool, right? So if you're working on skill acquisition piece, that isn't going to happen in one training session. More than likely, that's going to happen over a prolonged period of time in a variety of context for someone to be able to develop a technique or skill. Whereas actually, if you can reflect it on my intentions or how I want the session to feel, it's far easier to reflect on that because you can see it playing out, or you can have dialogue with players going, today I wanted it to feel pressurized or chaotic or time pressured. Did you sense that? Or you might even ask the question, how did you feel in that session, and see what you get back. So actually, it's probably easier to reflect on that, on short termism in particular, than maybe going down a technical tactical piece, which is probably not going to be done over a 20-minute, hour and a half long session.
Yeah, and also for me, if you think about like the context that we're both coaching in, we're not also talking about multiple coaches, and multiple coaches having a decent idea of what good might look like for us in this session. So if we're and the classic one is, let's say we are looking at let's look at we're trying to refine or acquire a new skill. Well, if I don't have a view on how difficult that might be for the players and how desirably difficult I want that to be for the players, then my reflection becomes either, oh, well, I know that my practice design methods are the best ones, so those are the ones I'll use, and don't worry about anything else. Or they did it loads and they did it really well, so they must be getting better at it, which we equally know to be untrue. So instead, it's okay. Well, how difficult do I want this to be, and what's my level of what's my personal marker for? Let's say it's, and this is you can tell now. This is where my football knowledge starts running out. Let's say it's we're working at left foot control. Well, what does good look like, and what's the bandwidth for good bad? And because we want players to make mistakes, how many mistakes do we want them to make? And what is a mistake here? Is it all of those things need to be wrapped up in a coach's observation and the coach's understanding of what they're trying to do.
You've led me really nicely onto what my next question was going to be, actually. So obviously for you working in this space, you're going to get a lot of individuals from a variety of sports. So obviously you'll have rugby, which you have really good working knowledge of, and you'll have other sports which have good but maybe not as good a rugby working knowledge. How do you go around upskilling yourself to understand that, so that when you're having those interactions with coaches, you're able to provide them with feedback? Because you may have someone who's water polo you've never seen in your life, but actually that could still be a really valuable interaction as long as you've got a base level of knowledge. So how do you go around finding out, I guess, some of the tactical, technical, whatever bits that you'll need to have a base layer of understanding within that sport?
Well, one, I think it's really important to acknowledge the fact that there is no football coach I've ever worked with or going to work with that I'm ever going to walk in and start advising them on the technical, tactical elements of the game. And I think that is just so important to recognise, because in any instance, you've got to know what you know and you don't know. And I hope what comes across to any football coach here, I think I've made it pretty plainly obvious that, yeah, I watch a lot of football. I enjoy hearing other people's opinions about the game, technically, tactically. But I certainly don't know enough to be offering people like yourself or anybody that you work with any input whatsoever on that. So I'm staying quiet. The broader principle for me is that I would see knowledge in coaching as being in four bases, if you like, broadly. And this is work of Andy Abraham, of Christine Nash, where they've classified it and gone, look, there's the sport, technically, tactically. And every coach everywhere needs to have a really in-depth understanding of their game, their sport. Two, knowledge of the person. And that's often like let's say, physiology, psychology, lots of things with ologies on the end. So it's not necessarily a more pseudo psychological thing where we go, oh, I know this person. It's knowledge of the person, also some fundamental principles. There is knowledge of pedagogy, science of coaching and learning. And then probably the last one, which I think is certainly, in my opinion, becoming more and more prevalent and important, is curriculum knowledge. What are the types of experiences that we want players or athletes to have as they progress? And for me, I might be able to offer a level of expertise in understanding the person, particularly psychologically. But my main area is pedagogy, and I'm there to support a coach with their pedagogy, supporting them with understanding their coaching approach, their learning design, and that is my role when working with a coach. It's definitely not technical, tactical.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice bit in terms of figuring out where you can sit in those interactions as well. I've been doing a little bit of coach development work internally recently, and I was very much hands off, observing sessions, and someone stood out to me and go, why are you doing that? And I was like, what do you mean? They said, well, actually, part of the upsides to you working in football for the last 10 years and having played it prior to that is that you will have a base level of being able to go in and deliver. He goes, and actually working, co-coaching with someone, delivering and analysing together and trying to get outcomes together and all that type of stuff is just as powerful as you standing behind and making a discussion point. And I think it really resonates with what you're saying there, is actually what part of those four areas am I looking to hit, or can I hit, or can I assist with, and being comfortable that on that day at that time, that's what I'm going to go after. And in different contexts, I'm just going to add value in a different area. So it might be with the under sevens being an extra pair of eyes to the chaos that's going on with the coaches. For the B team, it might be looking at pedagogy and how they're working with players with tactical implementation and stuff. So I think that's a really nice format of what you've discussed there.
Oh, completely. And I think coach development has actually fallen into a bit of a trap where there is almost a standoffish role for the coach developer, where there is a way of doing this. And I'm in complete agreement with you that just as you'd expect a coach to adopt different methods depending on the needs of the individual athletes in front of you, well, coach developers should be adopting different methods based on the individual needs of the coach in front of them. Now, whilst I'm not going to be getting in with a football coach and demonstrating anything, because that's not a skill set I've got. So I'm not going to be embarrassing myself by doing so. But ultimately for me, it just depends on what's the, again, coach developer coach. What are your intentions for impact as a coach developer? And how are you designing learning experiences for the coach? And if that involves demonstrating something, if it involves co-coaching, then great. But there's just, much like there is adopting more directive approaches with players, there are upsides and downsides to that, just as there is with any educational interaction.
And one of the bits you did mention there was around the curriculum piece, and I think particularly in academies that I've worked in, curriculums are a real big part of who we are. You have your West Ham way, your Southampton way, Tottenham way, etc. And I imagine you would have had similar both at Wasps, but also during your time at Leicester previously, etc. Where, am I right in thinking you're academy manager at Leicester?
Head coach.
Head coach. So got it wrong, but near enough. So in that space there, did you guys have one, a curriculum, and two, did you have like a Leicester type player? So was there particular characteristics that you wanted in your players that were coming through the pathway?
Well, first up, I'd say people use the term curriculum in lots of different ways. And depending which sport you go to, curriculum will mean something very different. And some people, when you hear the word curriculum, they'll go, "I'm not interested, go away." Now, so to be clear, in the way that I'm using curriculum, every sport everywhere will have a curriculum, which is, these are the experiences that players, athletes have when they're interacting with you. So curriculum is more about the experience of the player than it is anything that's written down. And there's some interesting work in education that looks at different levels of the curriculum. So there's the planned curriculum. This is what we are planning to offer. There's the delivered curriculum, which is, this is what we, from a coach's perspective, this is what we have offered. And there is the experienced curriculum, which is the one that I'm talking about. And that often gets confused with a syllabus, which is about content. So, is there a curriculum? Yes, there is always one. Doesn't matter where you go. Is it a coherent one where we're lacing together different elements of an athlete's experience and that lots of people are integrated and working towards something that's coherent? I think that's a very mixed thing. In my experience, we'll talk most recently about my experience with Wasps. Yes, there is a reasonably clear, and I hope, based on some of the more recent work that we've been doing, a more and more coherent curriculum for players that integrates lots of different elements of performance and provides appropriate levels of developmental challenge when for the right person at the right time.
I think that's a really interesting distinction, because you're right. As soon as you said curriculum, I was like, okay, style of play, tactics of play and stuff. But the experiential one, I think, would be really interesting. Is like, actually, can we plan what experiences look like over a year? And you might be able to work some tech tack around it. But actually, if this period might be real high stretch, so then you try and facilitate your games program to be high stretch. Or this one might be, we want it to be really, really creative, experimental periods. So actually, can we create our topics and our games program to allow them to explore and be creative and feel like there's an environment, and the coaches have then got to buy into that in a particular way. So I think that's a really interesting distinction you made between your syllabus and curriculum, and why there might be a bit of benefit down that space.
And also look, let's say we use a football example. I think that there's some really interesting things going on in academy football that I don't think are going on elsewhere. So we had the 4-4-2, 4-3-3 discussion earlier. Now, it might be, as an academy, we take a view that we're going to play in a particular formation every phase, every age group, and we might have pretty solid reasons for that. It becomes quite a narrow and quite focused curriculum where we might become very good or very at doing things in one way. Or we could go really broad, and nobody does this, but we'll change formation every week and everyone change position every week. Everyone will have lots of different experiences, and we'll play futsal on a Monday, we'll play whatever through the week, and we'll just go really broad. Most people operate somewhere in the middle of that, and I think it's less about because the tech tack is a fundamental part of my experience. Where do I spend more time in my journey? What am I better at? And uh, if I stay doing things that I'm technically, tactically very good at, well, that's my experience of that's my developmental experience. And it's lacing everything together so that the idea that you put forward about, right, if we have some, let's say in your context, we're playing Cat 2, Cat 3 academies for a block of time. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a experimental block. We're going to play in lots of different ways here, and we're going to test our tactical adaptability. That's a perfectly appropriate approach. It just means that it also requires coaches, administrators, academy managers, all of that to be on the same page. And it becomes a more systemic approach to coaching than just what the coach does when they walk on the grass.
And a lot of organising, because I imagine when I'm going into the ops department going, those games that we're meant to have, actually, could we swap? Could we swap those? And they're going, well, you're now causing us a headache for about 7 age groups across the academy. But yeah, let me see what I can do. But if you're talking about potential best practice for the experiences of the kids, that may be a good avenue to go down, because actually it might be that you're giving them exposure to different areas. I know that I've said this before in the podcast, but if you looked at the England national team a couple of years ago on my A license, we were discussing this, and all of them came through Cat 2 and Cat 3 academies. So you had like Jordan Pickford, I think was Sunderland. You had Harry Maguire and Carl Walker at Sheffield United. John Stones at Barnsley. I can't remember who the other person was. Actually, it was Luke Shaw. He was the only one who had been via that route. And the question then came up, well, how come none of your perceived big hitters were producing defenders? And a conclusion we came up with, which could be wrong, could be right, was actually they didn't get exposure of having to defend, because they were invariably the stronger teams. They had loads of opportunities to build the attack and create and whatnot. But when it then came to a situation when you're playing Neymar or Ronaldinho or Ronaldo or whoever, they hadn't had exposure of being under sustained pressure of defending all the time, which presented different challenges. So actually, if some of those top teams went, you know what, we're going to make this really hard for them, and it may just be for a 2-month block playing other top teams, or they're going to play up 2 age groups. So naturally, we are going to lose a lot of games during this time, but that's fine. Experientially, you might create a more holistic individual who has experienced more than just playing out from the back, being able to do double scissors and knowing if we're beginning to lose, we'll just give the ball to our mate in midfield who just runs the game and scores a load of goals and we win.
Oh, and obviously in the real world there are limitations to what you can and can't do there. But as you've just talked about, there are some really interesting ways that I think that academies can play with that idea. And I can't offer an opinion on the extent to which defenders are being developed by Cat 1 academies. I know that's a big talking point. But you might go, right, well, another reason I've heard for it is that every academy plays through the thirds and aren't facing enough. They're not facing long balls. They're not. I can't offer a view on it. I don't know. But if you're going, depending on the type of desired outcome you want, what are the academy's intentions for impact? Then you might manipulate things to give players different experiences. It just depends ultimately what you want, what the academy wants. And going back to your original question about questions that might want to be answered, is suddenly we start seeing challenge in a far broader sense than, say, what a lot of the current literature would show, which might focus on particular variables. And I think that is one of the most interesting areas that is out there at the moment.
Perfect. So coming back to, obviously mentioning your time at Wasps and stuff, when you're looking at the academy set, did you have like a set, these are the characteristics that we'd like our players to have? And if you did, were they tech stuff or were they more psychological? What did that look like?
So this depends a little bit, because I don't think that there is no here are the characteristics that same in my experience at Leicester, same in my experience at Wasps. There is no, these are the prerequisite characteristics that we need a player to have before they join. Same, there is no prerequisite for players who might leave, because I don't think that particularly, probably in football as well, I don't think that there is enough evidence to support any assertion that here is at the moment anyway, that here is the base level, minimum level of X, whatever X is, that a player needs in order to progress. Do we use profiling methods with players to understand where they currently are, where do we want them to be in 5 to 10 years' time, and then implement development planning process against that? Absolutely, yes. And I think that's perhaps a key difference.
And when you're looking at that profiling, how hard is it to future-proof it? Because again, I'm going to try and use some rugby knowledge here, so please excuse me if this goes completely left field. But going back to the time that I used to watch quite a lot of rugby, you had Christian Wade, who was playing at Wasps at the time, who was electric. Every time he got the ball, he would go past people. And then at Bath, you had Matt Banahan. And they were almost complete opposites in terms of thing, but play very similar positions. Now, in rugby, I appreciate there's fluidity in terms of, you might go for only your locks going into line out, but actually other people, they might put their six in there, which presents different mismatches and stuff. But when you're trying to future-proof individuals to be able to play rugby in 10 years' time, how hard is it to figure out what that might actually look like with the level of variability and how one player can come in? I'm thinking like Michael Hooper, I think from Australia, who came in relatively small in the scrum, but his ability to get around the pitch and be dynamic kind of presented a lot of issues for packs and stuff. So how challenging is that for people within the game to actually look at players and go, I'm going to try and give you the tools that I think are going to be there, but it could change so quickly that we might be going down a wrong path or wrong avenue?
Well, this comes to the heart of what I was talking about with curriculum knowledge, which is we've got to have almost we've got to be able to take a view on what might be needed in the future. In my opinion, rugby union hasn't changed that much. Hasn't fundamentally changed. There's no revolution in the game in where it has been or where it was. What has happened is that it's gradually evolved, and it's become players are now no bigger necessarily. They are leaner, they're quicker, they are fitter, and they're typically more skillful. So there is no massive revolution that's gone on. So I think you're perfectly capable of reasoning from where the game is now. There may well be law changes that come in that change that. One would be tackle height and whether tackle height starts affecting attacking play. And I think it'd be pretty clear that from that you could reason that if you're developing a player now who can't offload, you probably want to be developing players who can do that. The clearest example I can give you is when I was at Leicester, I had the privilege of coaching Freddie Stewart, who's now making a very good career for himself. And we looked at what Freddie could do really well. And he's 6'5", he's a fullback, and he is outstanding in the air. And we looked at what might stop him. And there were some physical attributes that may well have stopped him. And we just implemented a dual strategy, one where we make them absolute most of what he is good at, what you might call a performance factor. This is what's going to distinguish him at the very highest level. And then we look at a hygiene factor, which might be he needs to be good enough. He needs to be good enough in this particular physical regard, because if he isn't, that's going to stop him. And I think that you can apply that to a Christian Wade, to a Matt Banahan. You've got a very, very small player who is incredibly good with his feet, and you've got a very big player, and you can reason from an individual basis. And ultimately, in some situations, some coaches will pick Christian Wade, but not Matt Banahan, and vice versa. That's where the needs of the club and the needs of the individual might diverge a bit.
Apologies, my dog just in that was about to go, but she's just stopped, which is really good timing. But no, I think that makes complete sense, and I guess the question for me off the back of that is, for those players that you've seen progress, and I'm fortunate enough, I've worked with players now that are in and around our B team, first team and stuff. For you, for someone like a Freddie Stewart, etc. as well, is there anything that those players that have gone on to progress have had a common thread on in terms of their character or techniques or skills that you've gone, actually, the ones that have managed to kick on and get a good career out of the game, be that at professional level or playing for England or Lions, etc. Is there any common threads that you can see that they've all had in that space?
In some positions in rugby union, there are anthropometric factors, physical factors that you can't get around. Of players that I've seen progress in certain positions, there is a base minimum level of size that people need to have, and there is very little getting around that. If I looked at a broader thing, the number one thing that I've seen, and literature would support this as well, is I've never seen a player progress who wasn't mentally outstanding in at least a couple of areas. And I'll be quite specific when I say this. I don't necessarily mean somebody who just trains really hard all the time. I mean, they've got the capacity in a couple of areas, whether that be their ability to, we'll call it perform under pressure, but let's say focus and distraction control. They're outstanding at that, and that they have worked to develop that. I've never seen somebody progress who hasn't had a breadth of mental skill set, but being outstanding in at least a couple of areas.
Perfect. And last question for me, because I'm conscious of time and making sure that you're ready for your next meeting, which is, if I were to speak to the coaches you work with, or the students that you support, or the players that you coach, and ask them to describe you in 3 words, how would you hope they would describe you, and why?
After abusing me for a little bit, I would imagine that, well, this is what I would hope. I would hope people said that I really cared. I cared about them, and I cared about and helping them in the long term. That'd be the number one thing. The second thing I hope is that people regard me as being competent at what I do. And if I get both of those things, even with a hefty amount of abuse, then I'll be very happy.
Perfect. Listen, Jamie, really appreciate your time. I think a brilliant conversation into the mix between academia and practice and whatnot. So yeah, really appreciate your time, and hopefully we can catch up again soon.
Real pleasure, Michael. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Sports Initiative podcast with me, Michael Wright. Please remember to follow us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram at the Sports Initiative Podcast, and share this podcast with friends and family. I'll see you next week.